Here we are again, fellow tubers. Gotta say, 2023 was a long year for me. To the point that I have only the barest recollection of current events in the wider world. Lost another family friend, immediate family's been suffering all sorts of medical issues, and I have been going full blast since the beginning of the year. I've tried to expand my efforts on this channel, started seriously laying out the blueprints for various video games I want to become a reality. I've had all sorts of temp jobs, and I signed up for my first steady job in years. Altogether, it was a roller coaster of a year that I enjoyed for the most part. But this is rather late, and I would like to get it done sooner rather than later. So let's get right to the video games this time. This is a weird entry, because it came from mixing up my game schedule a bunch, and deciding to all in on the novelty of playing a bunch of stealth, thief-themed games alongside Final Fantasy IX. I've also been contemplating how to mix stealth into traditional JRPG formats, so I went looking for a turn-based stealth game, and this is what I ended up with. Spirited Thief is a really mixed bag for me. I enjoy these characters, how they interact, and the great pacing at which their relationships evolve. The gameplay is pretty fun. Making stealth turn-based cuts out the fiddly real-time execution aspects and leaves only the satisfaction of planning out a series of actions so that you nick all the loot and only get spotted when you want to. The scouting phase allows for a degree of believable planning that I haven't experienced in other stealth games, and there's some inspired uses of traps and level design. Unfortunately, the checkpoint system makes restarting a mission after a screw-up far more tedious than it needs to be. The strict limitations to 2 non-movement actions per level sucks a lot of empowerment out of the stealth fantasy, and the alarm system forces the player to move way too fast in a genre about patience. It wasn't a bad way to end the year, and I definitely recommend it to stealth fans.
No.
The dwarves may have dug too greedily and too deep. Actually, forget it. Tolkien's an environmentalist hippie. Drill, baby, drill! It's been a while since I could so quickly follow up a game I've played with its sequel, so it's interesting to compare two games so closely together. SteamWorld Dig 2 is almost everything you want out of a sequel. It makes everything good about the first game great, adds new types of content that feel like they always should have been there, doesn't diminish anything with poor execution, and shaves off the rough edges where it can. The already solid gameplay loop of digging through caves, lighting the darkness, collecting gems, and returning to town where you can exchange them for upgrades is now enhanced with handcrafted level design, which not only leads to better pacing, it also means the game feels like a proper world that you're exploring, rather than the overly long session of Dig Dug SteamWorld 1 felt like. A jetpack and grappling hook might be the most vanilla ideas in the genre, but novel scenarios such as using the grapple to anchor yourself against the wind, and synergy that arises from how the jetpack handles, not being able to fire weapons or mine until upgraded, allow for some solid skill expression, which makes this a really great execution of the concept. The new sidekick and townspeople are a big step up in the world building and story progression, which is especially notable during the sequence where you're isolated and face the full force of Vectron's corruption. Now that I'm finished, I don't think I like it as much as the rest of the internet, but it's pretty great.
8.
I did it again. I went and got obsessed with an idle game. After I finished Territory Idle, I should have let it die, but apparently I'd formed a habit, and this filled that void. Thing is, I think on some level, Idle Skilling does an even better job of demonstrating what is so appealing about this type of game. It just keeps unfolding, and once you get to a certain point, there's so much to do when you have the time to actively play that optimizing all the screens is like finding a perfect rotation in an MMO. Like, it starts with the typical upgrade your dudes and beat as many enemies as possible before you scratch everything, restart with upgrades that let you get further formula. But as you do, you gain perk points, which not only upgrade you further, but unlock whole new sections of the game that have their own progression systems. By endgame, you've got like 5 different scenarios for the base MMO rotation style combat, 5 different types of resources to gather, and at least 2 separate collections to complete. On top of that, the creator is very genre savvy, so the game is oozing with all kinds of mimetic humor, and is stuffed to the brim with cool secrets, which you can find yourself through normal gameplay, but some of which will involve some impossible quiz level out-of-the-box thinking, or scanning every single inch of every screen. Then there's the genuinely fun minigames that make gaining the purchasable currency perfectly accessible for a full free-to-play run. By no means does this have an amazing plot, nor does it have the deepest combat. But I lost my save file twice over the course of my playthrough, and still enjoyed the journey of using every new optimization trick to speedrun back to where I was, and then on to the next stage of the game faster. As of this recording, I'm afraid there might not be as great a payoff as Territory Idle. But hey, journey, not the destination.
7.
Do you know how to use that thing? Sure. Point the end goes in the other map. The surprise hit of the year! Back at the inception of this channel, I had a script for the top 10 games you should absolutely play instead of Skyward Sword. At the time, I had played everything on that list except one. This year, I finally got around to it, and can confirm this is so much more fun than Skyward Sword. For starters, the story is more palatable for me personally. Futuristic Wild West, featuring vaguely superhuman samurai and ninjas, in a revenge tale against the rival clan who slaughtered an outcast clansman for a sword made from a meteorite, is beautifully pulpy. And while it never pretends it's more than it actually is, it uses its premise to set the stage for some really fun set pieces. On a technical level, the one-to-one of the sword controls might not be there, but Red Steel 2 is a blast to play, with all kinds of guns and sword techniques to bust some skulls, blast through armor, and destroy some mooks in style. Not only do the motion controls add an extra layer of visceral game feel, but the decision making to disarm, stun, increase damage, or reposition based on certain attacks or enemy types, without making any one the designated strategy, elevates this into one of the more visceral and strategic action games I've played. The pinpoint controls of the Wiimote, the light gun style slowing of enemy movement for easier shots, and the fact that you can target multiple body parts on a given enemy, and a variety of objects in the environment, all caters to my OCD desire to only shoot when it's going to make some real impact. It might not be a revolutionary action adventure, but this is a rare example from the Wii era that makes me wish, against all logic, for a sequel on a modern system. Even though I'm feeling fairly stoked here at the end of the year, back during the beginning of the year, I had traveled south of Optimism, east of Excited, north of Exhausted, and maybe just a little bit west of Loathing. Get out the pencils and draw up some saddles for the horses. We're about to mosey on into town. Meet the Loathing franchise, an absurdist, self-aware, and downright sarcastic RPG that reimagines historical periods with a little more or less color. In this game, we follow the old adage to head west, young man, in a version of America's wild frontier populated by demonic cows, hysterical bean wizards, ancient aliens, and fungus goblins. This is the kind of game where they give you the first skill, Walk Stupid, for free, so your stick figure avatar can spend the whole playthrough alternating between flailing their arms and legs, walking on their hands, and doing the worm as their walk cycle. Every single interaction in the game is slathered in snark and genre savviness that only the best can rival. Despite that, it doesn't rely on the humor. There's a solid RPG hidden in this haystack. Your choices in class, sidekick, horse, and other such paraphernalia are non-refundable after the tutorial town, and have lasting mechanical and world-building consequences. You can technically get through a majority of the scenarios that are intended to be resolved by violence without ever engaging with the turn-based combat, and can get around many of the potential negative consequences for each scenario. But to do so requires patience to get your stats up and explore the world thoroughly enough to find clever solutions both narratively and mechanically. If you do choose to start up a brawl, there's a robust, if poorly balanced, combat system that involves positioning, stats modified by your diet, and powerful items that can be just as effective in the right circumstances as your basic attacks acquired by level up. It's not quite Baldur's Gate 3, but it scratches a similar itch for me.
5.
Your worst inhibitions tend to psych you out in the end. 6 years ago, I started recording the playthrough of most games that I play with the intention of using the content for this YouTube channel. And I started with a 3D platformer about kids being taught how to use psychic powers at summer camp. It was every bit the enjoyable ride I expected it to be, even if the combat and platforming weren't the best. Now, so many years later, the sequel has finally arrived, and oh boy does it live up to the hype. Psychonauts 1 was a collectathon platformer set in a world kind of like a Nickelodeon show. Psychonauts 2 is a full season of that hypothetical show you happen to be able to play. The story twists Raz's first steps into the life of a psychonaut with the fallout of running away from home, the danger hinted at near the end of Psychonauts 1, and all while helping the older generation, which eventually leads to one of the best musical numbers in gaming. The gameplay has been refined such that pyrokinesis, psyblast, and telekinesis are truly useful combat options now, even when you're not fighting the enemies designated for each ability, while maintaining an identity that distinguishes them from similar attacks in other games. Like Whispering Rock, the Mother Lobe, and surrounding forest attractions are a strong contender for the coolest, most detailed level hub in a collectathon platformer. But where Psychonauts 1's later areas felt empty and disjointed, the 3 phases of Psychonauts 2's overworld unfold perfectly in sync with the expanding themes and evolving threat introduced throughout the story. Finally, story and gameplay meld together into some wild set pieces that crank up the series' stylish appeal to 11. With my personal favorite being the cooking game show themed around anxiety. 20 years later, we came looking for Raz the boy, and we found Rasputin, the Psychonaut. Elevator pitch. What if a children's activity sheet was a video game? That was all I needed to hear for a purchase, but in playing through it, I came to realize it's so much more than that. Ever play Animal Crossing and want a game starring Isabella? Want a Zelda alternative where the big bad is based off of relatable struggles of imposter syndrome and the unreasonable expectations of the past generation placed on the new one? Was MS Paint your favorite game growing up? Well, this might be the game for you. There's a whole conversation about linear versus open game design that's been on my mind a lot lately, and while I usually lean towards open design, this game does a lot of good stuff with its restrictions on the player. Chicory, a colorful tale. Again, it starts as a children's activity sheet, so you have a magic paintbrush that can color anywhere on the black and white world of the game. But as the story unfolds, simple paint program mechanics gradually get added to your toolset, and each one fills in for traditional Metroidvania abilities, in such novel but pure satisfying ways that every one of them had me impressed with the mileage they got out of this simple premise. You can't just pick all the colors in the game immediately either. For a majority of the game, you're limited to the colors local to the specific biomes of the game's world, which not only fosters creativity, but also provides some brilliant aesthetic storytelling. Then you get into other largely cosmetic tools you unlock through side quests, and the game becomes just as much about decorating and sprucing up your personal island as it is fixing the catastrophe going on in the background. Speaking of the catastrophe going on, the game has a very wholesome message about working hard for your dreams and using your gifts to help others, while remembering to take time for yourself, not just to avoid burnout, but to simply enjoy the simpler aspects of life and your personal talents. It also helps, in my opinion, that it deconstructs the message of destined heroism that a lot of action adventures have. Just a sec, gotta add some happy trees here next to this quiet stream, and set up a campsite for our main character to relax by.
3.
I like to strain out as much negativity as possible in these countdowns. This is supposed to be a fun recap of some Supergiant games I played in the last year I'm sharing with a Supergiant audience. But after 10 years of focusing my video game time on my backlog, sometimes it feels less like I'm chasing a horizon of endless possibility and more rogue, like I'm wandering through the ever-shifting gloom, hoping that the next pyre will be a bastion of fun. It's fine though. You don't repair a transistor, and you certainly don't overcome depression if you just sit around moping. Alright, one more time. So Hades is really fun. Who knew? Zagreus is a likable protagonist who's constantly reassessing the status quo and the information given to him, is mostly even-tempered and polite, all while being a bit of a spoiled brat who causes a lot of turmoil in his quest for answers about his birth. I'm really not a fan of Greek mythology, but this nuanced, personal, and somewhat kinder version, looking on the bright side of death, breathes a special kind of fun into the experience that makes the evolving story of reconciliation amongst Hades' family, the meta-redemption of a number of side characters, and the politics of immortal society in this world subtly unfolding in the background, an incredibly satisfying reward for simply playing through even a failed run. Of course, the real draw is that gameplay loop. All the weapons feel great, whether you're mashing buttons or strategically planning your attacks. Between the 6 different weapons, the dash, and the ranged cast attack, all modified by the permanent upgrades you can get over the course of your many run-throughs, the various randomized boons from the gods, and Daedalus's hammers, no run will play out quite the same, but you have enough control to develop a personal strategy more nuanced than get good. Personally, I really like the Adamant Rail. Not just because it's kind of OP, but because I enjoy the synergy between special and basic attacks. The heat system is an ingenious way to incentivize trying new weapons by limiting your ability to acquire the most precious materials, which are used for crafting and side quests, but not required for the main quest. Having not finished the overarching narrative, I can't say where it'll land on the top games, but so far, it's joining the small list of games I just can't stop playing. Back in 2018, I said that Breath of the Wild would eventually be surpassed. And while I stand by that, this isn't that game. Tears of the Kingdom is DLC. DLC so good that it nearly replaces the base game altogether, but still DLC. Building a Zonai vehicle to cross a large distance quickly without burning stamina, then stumbling on a tower which now launches you high in the sky, where you will glide until you land on a sky island, take in an even broader view of this version of Hyrule's gorgeous landscapes, then do some side quests for a Zonai construct, before meticulously building a rocket-propelled glider to fly across a whole region of the massive map in seconds, so you can skydive into a giant gaping wound in the earth, where you'll fight some truly terrifying echoes of Ganondorf over a shirt that references some prior Zelda game, is still a kind of exploration that imitators don't quite nail. Most of the combat system's improvements are, on paper, just polishing what was already there, but things like fusing any item to an arrow to add on a number of useful features, or the ability to throw any item instead of just weapons, so versatile and so seamlessly installed into the game's engine that I find myself resorting to them even when they tank my DPS and eat up my valuable resources. I'll admit, I share the general consensus that having the sages following the player around gets really clunky. But I found them on the whole much more fun to use during a fight than the champion abilities. Tulin's Gust, with its lateral movement focus in particular, is a great pivot from Revali's Gale because of all the cheap ascension tools in this game. I still stand by the opinion that the Blight Ganons were some of the best fights in the franchise. But there's no arguing that both the main bosses and the optional mini-bosses are more varied in appearance, have a better sense of Zelda-style progression, and are just more fun to fight overall. Especially Ganondorf himself, who has never been this tough but fair of a challenge in all the time I've played this franchise. At the end of the day, despite some annoying restrictions caused by the devs' design philosophies and some personal disillusionment with the Zelda franchise's narrative direction, this is still one of the most fun games I've played in years. And now some honorable mentions before number 1. Fantasy Strike. Tried this out earlier this year in my attempts to give the fighting game genre a bit more of a go, and to prove to myself that I can handle fighting games if they have reasonable controls, as this game was doing simple inputs long before Street Fighter 6. I really enjoyed what I did play of it, but the limited single-player / unconventional ranked mode left me wanting more. Botanacula! Step aside, Pikmin 4. Here comes the real explore a world with insect-sized critters in a complex microbiome. Yet another alumni of the Extra Credits Games You Might Not Have Tried Club. It's a funny, wholesome, and atmospheric adventure game that gave me real The Neverhood vibes. So if you like adventure games, or that particular type of chaotic but cohesive world, I definitely recommend checking this out. 1. Humankind cannot gain anything without first giving something in return. To obtain, something of equal value must be lost. That is alchemy's first law of equivalent exchange. Lol. So, Fullmetal Alchemist this ain't, but it's totally my new favorite JRPG franchise. Narratively, it's a whole bunch of typical JRPG tropes about teenagers defeating some ancient evil. But for the most part, the game is a cozy slice of life where Ryza's gang explore the local forests, mountains, and ruins, while helping the people on their island home with a variety of random tasks. There's an amazing loop of scavenging every corner of the overworld for crafting ingredients, then using the many tools you crafted yourself to harvest them, fighting monsters along the way to keep your skills sharp, and coming back to base to do some crafting. The skits, featuring main characters and NPCs alike, that seem to pop up every time you come back from exploring, and the actual side quests that come in sequences telling multiple chapter stories, which sometimes weave together two separate characters' stories when they both reach a mutually beneficial solution to their individual predicaments, is the icing on the cake of that loop. The combat combines a mash the attack button variation of timed hits for basic attacks, meter management that consists of balancing the capacity to cast spells with sacrificing meter to upgrade to higher level spells and add more hits per an attacking round to your basic attacks, items that have a limited number of charges for each trip into the overworld, and special attack orders that incentivize using specific actions to unleash more devastating attacks from your allies into a thrilling, visceral, risk-reward system that I always look forward to. Finally, we come to the best part of the game, the crafting system. Each item has these nodes that need to be filled out with materials with the right amount of charges to unlock specific effects. But you also want to use ingredients that add various traits to the item, and each category of item can be very picky about what traits will actually work on them. On top of that, there's a decision of crafting routes. Because certain recipes can build into crafting completely different items from when you started, which reloads your finite number of charges for crafting an individual item, sometimes throwing an even bigger pile of materials at one craft is better for the end product. The game also has fantastic pacing. There are so many systems for optimal farming that if you learned them all in the first chapter, you wouldn't be able to internalize the information. But because of good pacing, it's more like every other chapter you unlock some cool new system to play with. Honestly, I could gush about this game all day, but because I have every intention of finishing this trilogy and at least one more in the franchise, I'll be talking about it again soon enough. Cut, print, that's a wrap. Hope you had nearly as much fun watching this as I had playing these games. And as usual, I hope you were introduced to some games you maybe hadn't tried before. I have a lot of ambitions this year, from getting back into shape to programming games and making more videos for this channel, to actually reaching my quota of my backlog this year. So I want to get right back to it. But life always seems to throw a wrench in when we seem to have everything ready to go smoothly. Regardless, I wish you all a happy 2024 and happy gaming.